At least, that's how it felt the first time I realized her eyes weren't made of stone the way the rest of her was. They followed me, not with a turn of the head or a scraped echo of granite across granite, but with a presence like heat you notice only after you've been standing in it too long. You step into the open, blink at the brightness, and somewhere under your ribs a small animal decides to run. I grew up in Baltimore, in a narrow row house with a cracked stoop and neighbors who argued through open windows in the summer. My mother, Linda, could tell a story better than anyone on our block. She'd lean her elbows on the chipped kitchen counter and pour coffee into a cup she never washed properly. And she'd talk about the old days as if she kept them in a drawer. Some of her stories were true. Most were not. Truth had never been the point with her. Baltimore had its own folklore, and she collected it the way some people collect spoons. The one that mattered to us was about a statue people called Black Aggie. Ask 10 folks in the city and you'd get 12 versions of the tale. Eyes glowing red at midnight, the dead rising to hold counsel around her. If you dared to sleep in her lap, you'd die within 14 days. That's the way stories work in a place like ours. They breed in the gaps between fear and boredom. We didn't live near the cemetery where Aggie was supposed to be, but we did live a few minutes from Ledin Park Cemetery, where my grandparents were buried. Ledin Park was a place of hills and trees and quiet, a place where the wind remembered your first name. There was an old mausoleum at the bottom of a wooded glen, looked like a church that had given you panned up above it. On a grassy rise, a statue of an angel reading a book. The angel had a woman's face, contemplative, chin propped on one hand, as if the page she held was both a comfort and a sentence. That's her, my mother would say, nodding toward the angel. Don't you look at her too long. You don't want her to notice you. My father, Frank, rolled his eyes and said nothing. He didn't argue with Linda because he never needed to. He had other ways of making a point. I spent more of my childhood in that cemetery than at any park. We'd go on the pretense of visiting my grandparents. But really it was because the world in there made more sense to my mother than the one outside. The living disappointed her. The dead didn't talk back. My parents had a pastime they found hilarious. When I wandered too far reading stones or tracing cracks in marble, they'd drive the car out of sight and wait for me to notice. I'd turn and see nothing but the slope, the road, the green, and all the names of all the people who would never answer. Then I'd run, the edges of the world going white as my vision narrowed, until the car reappeared and my mother laughed like I'd told a joke. It happened enough that it stopped feeling like a lesson and started feeling like a promise. You will be left. People who love you will drive away. It becomes a kind of religion after a while. God as a tail light vanishing over a hill. One afternoon when I was 11, they did it not far from the angel. I caught a slice of chrome vanishing past a row of boxwoods and decided I wouldn't cry. I said it out loud. I won't cry. As if telling the statue would make it true. I turned to the angel. The late sun scraped across her cheek and down her throat, gilding the book in her lap. I'd always thought of her as beautiful in a way that made me nervous. The way a teacher is beautiful when you're too young to understand the mechanics of your own attention. I stood there and, without deciding to, said, "Black Aggie is beautiful." The sound that followed was not a sound you expect to hear in daylight. A giggle, high and bright and close, like a silver bell tapped against glass. I spun so fast I stumbled, my sneaker grinding in the gravel. There was no one, just stones, trees, the hiss of an insect too small to see. The giggle came again, farther off, and then, there she was, down in the glen, past the mausoleum, between two walnut trees, a woman in black. She wore robes that touched the ground, a hood that had everything but the suggestion of a face. The world around her bent the way heat bends above a highway in July. My mind told my legs to run. My legs told my mind to wait. I walked toward her. I know how that sounds. You hear a child say a statue is beautiful, and then he follows a hooded figure into the trees, and you want to shake him. I wish I could, but there was something about her that felt like shelter. Like the way a porch light can mean the world when you're 6 and caught in a storm. At the creek, a wooden footbridge arched from stone to stone. The place under it was dry and hidden from the rodone of those harmless secrets the earth keeps. When I looked back toward the trees, The woman was gone, but I had the sense she'd brought me here on purpose. I crouched in the shadow and listened to water click against rocks. When the Ford rolled slowly past, the windows down, my mother's voice cutting the air, "Daniel? Daniel, where did you go?" I didn't answer. I waited until her anger curled into worry and then stepped out. Hands muddy, face clean. She scolded me all the way home, but I watched the rearview mirror and caught a scrap of my own smile. That night I lay in bed and whispered, "Thank you," into the dark. Not to God, to Aggie. If that makes you uneasy, it should. It makes me uneasy now. But at 11, gratitude doesn't ask for paperwork. It just finds the nearest ears and believes they're listening. I stopped crying in the cemetery after that. I still felt afraid. Fear was an organ in my body by then, but it was fear with a lid on it. Fear that knew where to sit and when to speak. 2 years passed. I turned 13, grew longer in the bones, learned the shape of my face in a way that felt both new and inevitable. Halloween came on a wind that smelled like leaves and sugar. For the first time, my mother didn't walk me house to house. I slung a pillowcase over my shoulder and set about filling it the way a boy thinks you're supposed to fill things when you finally get to be alone. I ran into my brother, Joel, near a row of townhouses where someone had put a record player in the window to blast the Monster Mash into the street. Joel had taken his girlfriend, Tessa, to a party and found it too loud. With them were 2 boys I didn't like, but recognized. Craig, who had a face like an exclamation point, and Benny, whose laughter had no brakes. We walked a while. They were older, a year or 2 beyond me. But Joel didn't shoo me off. It felt like a holiday inside the holiday. I stayed quiet because I wanted not to be sent away. Near midnight, Craig said, "Shortcut through Leden Park. If you're not chicken." Benny made chicken sounds. He was the kind of person who sees a line and puts both feet over it because he's never had to suffer for where he's standing. Joel looked at me, and in that look I read the history of every time I'd been left among the stones. I understood there was a plan to separate me, scare me, make me stumble into old panic so they could watch. Some people like to watch you fall because it makes their own balance feel earned. "Let's take them to see Aggie," I said. All the air changed gears. You could hear the new speed in it. Tessa's hand tightened on Joel's wrist. "Wrong cemetery," Craig said. "Too loud." "Wrong story," Benny said, and then laughed to make the sentence survive. Joel said, "Mom says the statue in Leden is the real one." He didn't believe it. But the word mom carries weight you can't calculate with an instrument. We cut through a gap in the fence near the back gate and slid into the kind of dark that doesn't belong to a city. Even the cars on the road beyond the oaks sounded less real. The graves reflected moonlight like they remembered it from other nights. The Angel's Hill rose quiet and patient above the glen. We moved single file, Craig in front, Benny barking behind. Joel and Tessa fell a little back. I could tell from the way she looked at him that she wanted him to be braver than he was, and that he couldn't ever be braver than he was, and that this would be the ruin of something later, when the leaves weren't orange and the night wasn't allowed to be this soft. I quickened my pace to get ahead. I knew the path, bare left at the 2 sycamores, 30 yards to the mausoleum. Then the slope and the statue waiting at the top like a teacher ready to receive a recitation. I wanted to reach the statue first so I could hide and teach them something about their own laughter. The glen smelled like water and iron. I followed a deer track I knew and came out just below the angel. Her book lay open in her lap as if the words were sleeping. I tucked myself behind a granite headstone and waited. Voices arrived like coins rolling down a table. "There," Craig said, pointing. "There she is. I told you this is nothing. It's just a thing in the ground." Benny leaned close to the angel and made a show of studiously reading her book. "Says here," he announced, "that if you kiss me, I turn into a real boy." Tessa said, "Don't be gross." Joel said, "Guys." I reached out and closed my fingers around Benny's ankle. I let a low note come out of my throat. Not a word, just the sound fear makes when you put your hand in it. Benny screamed with an honesty I admired. He lunged backward, tripped, and fell into Craig, who swore and staggered. For a breath. It was perfect. The kind of perfect a child believes gets put into a jar somewhere and kept for days you need it. Then their fear collapsed into embarrassment. And embarrassment is just anger wearing remarkable shoes. They saw me, and their faces did the math. And they ran. I stood and ran too. I knew enough not to laugh this time. You don't run because you're devastated. You run because you remember what it was like to be left, and you intend not to be left again. The mausoleum was a black box at the bottom of the glen. In one of its dust-filmed windows, something moved. I tell you this knowing you don't have to believe me. A shadow passed. One shape inside a darker one. And every small animal under my ribs decided I was no longer a suitable landlord. Left of the mausoleum, the ground fell toward the creek. The bridge arched over it like a shrug. I ducked under, pressed my back to the cool of the stone, and listened. Boots on planks. The thin groan of wood. Voices turned down low by the need to sound braver than you feel. Where'd he go? Craig said. I saw him run down here. Forget him, Benny said, but he didn't sound like he meant it. Joel called from somewhere up the slope. Daniel? Not loud. Not for the others. Just for me. Let's scare him back. Craig whispered. He wants to play? We'll play. I held my breath, so hard my chest hurt. Water stitched sound around me. A spider anchored a thread to my sleeve and waited to see who we were to each other. The night had settled into that rhythm where all the noises agree to share the air. Above me the bridge creaked once. Then not at all. Then the sound changed. It stopped being boys afraid of being laughed at and became a chorus I didn't recognize. It took me a second to find the word for it. Reverence. Craig said. What is that? Benny said nothing. Tessa said nothing. Joel said my name again. And it broke across the glen. I waited until the silence had a shape. Then slowly, carefully, I slid out from the shadow of the bridge and stood up into the open. She was on the embankment, 10 feet above. The hood was drawn. The robes were not the robes of a person who might unfold her arms and ask you a question. They were a weather. The moon found her, and then lost her, and then found her again, because the clouds had decided to reconsider themselves. And under the hood were eyes. Not eyes the way you mean when you say a word because the language requires it. Eyes like the edges of a knife. Eyes like red glass held to a flame. I had time to be so afraid I could taste what I'd eaten for dinner. Then I had time to be ashamed that I was afraid. Then I had no time at all because the world removed itself from me like a blanket. There is a part of your body that decides whether your heart is a carnival ride or a house. And that part of my body chose carnival. I tried to step backward and couldn't. My knees unlocked without consulting me, and I sat down hard in the creek. The cold was an instruction. I could feel the water take my socks and go to work on them. She watched. I knew she watched not because I could see her face, which I couldn't, but because I could feel my own face being seen. A heat rose in me that had nothing to do with the red behind her hood. I remembered being 7 and running toward an empty road until the car reappeared and my mother beckoned lazily like I was a dog with a trick to perform. I remembered being 9 and reading names on stones so I wouldn't have to look at her laughing. I remembered the first afternoon I said, Aggie is beautiful, and the sound that told me I was right to believe something impossible. Please, I said. It came out as a whisper that had been punched. I'm sorry. Her anger didn't feel like an anger aimed at me. It felt like an anger aimed at what I'd allowed. What I'd learned to call love because it had the shape of attention. Anger at the way I'd taken abandonment and turned it into worship. Not her worship. Theirs. I don't know how long we stayed like that. There was a second, and then there was another, and then all the seconds had agreed this would be their job. And then, nothing. The embankment was empty. The hood was not a hood, but a place the air had been. The eyes were not eyes, but the memory of a color a child paints with when he's run out of red. Daniel. Joel's voice. Closer now. He sounded the way a person does who has begun to understand something permanent about himself and doesn't know yet how to survive it. I climbed the bank with water in my shoes. The night peeled back, and the cemetery remembered what it was for the keeping of names. Joel grabbed my arm and looked at my face. What happened? Nothing, I said. And then, because the seconds had taught me to tell the truth when it helped, I said, I saw her. Tessa put her hand over her mouth. Craig had already walked away. Benny stared at the bridge and said, "Nope," out loud to whatever he thought he might owe the place. We should have left then. We should have gone out through the gap in the fence and let the night wash us into the street. But I had the sense I couldn't go without saying something that would be heard. Not by Joel. Not by the boys. Not by my mother, who wasn't here but who lived in places you couldn't move out of with a U-Haul. By her. I went back up to the statue of the angel with the book. I stood in front of her and looked at the hand under her chin. The curve of cheek. The small shadow the book cast across her lap. I said, "I'm sorry," so quietly the stone could keep it. Then I knelt and kissed the marble foot. Joel breathed in sharply like I'd touched a stove. "We're going," he said. And we did. On the walk out. I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 11. Except this time it had a vocabulary. I felt watched in a way that isn't punishment. I felt kept in a way that isn't possession. I felt a warning that wasn't a threat. There are languages you learn only after the person who speaks them has taught you to be afraid of the wrong gods. I didn't see her again that night. We climbed through the fence and stepped into the life that waits outside the places where stories look at you and decide whether to speak. Joel walked Tessa home. Craig and Benny went somewhere to forget. I went to bed and slept with my shoes on because I didn't want to take them off and see what the water had done. Years take a shape in your memory that doesn't match the calendar. I left home, earned a living doing things that felt useful when I did them and ordinary when I told people about them. I married once and didn't keep it. I learned, to my surprise, that sometimes the people who love you stay. And you can look at that fact too long and scare it away. So I tried not to. I came home for holidays and funerals and the kind of ordinary weekends that get made sacred by guilt. I saw her 4 more times. Never for long. Never with the kind of clarity a courtroom would require. Once on the far side of a lake in Maine, where the water was so black at night, you could believe in it the way you believe in sleep. I was walking a path of pine needles with a woman I was trying to become brave enough to love. The path bent, and the moon poured down into a clearing. And there at the edge of it a hood turned to consider me. And then the trees were empty, and a loon called from the middle of the world, and the woman I was with asked if I'd heard that, and I said yes. Because what else was there to say? Once in a hospital hallway when my father was dying. He'd always been a quiet man whose quietness made noise. He lay in a bed that made him look smaller, which I hadn't known was possible. And he reached for my wrist, and missed it, and said my name like he wished it were another. I went outside the room and stood with my forehead against the cool of the window. And a reflection in the glass didn't match the lights behind me. A hood, red in the places that had learned that color. And then only a corridor. Only a vending machine that preferred dollar bills without creases. Once at the edge of my mother's backyard when we pretended to reconcile and couldn't. The grass there had been a better listener than any of us. She told a story about the time we'd all gone to Ledin Park, and she taught me a lesson about wandering off and how I'd never done it again. I told a story about what it felt like to be taught. We looked at each other, and both of us understood it would have been easier if one of us had been a better liar. When I turned to leave, a dark sleeve emptied itself of light 3 fences over. And I thought of the ways a person is haunted by the things they find useful. Once on a winter morning when I woke before the sun, I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee that shook in the cup because something in my hand had learned a new language. The window glass was blacker than the coffee. I saw her on the sidewalk as she must have been if the world that held her were the same world that held me. Not a trick of light. Not an idea with a hood. A woman in black. A face not shown. She didn't turn toward the house. She didn't need to. I understood the message without reading it. I am not here to frighten you. The message said, I am here because I have always been here. When it is time for you to go, I will be here. You can live for decades with a promise like that and still be surprised when the world keeps it. I went back to Ledin Park when I was 57 because they put my aunt in the ground, and there are rituals even reluctant people attend. The angel was still there. Book open. Unweathered in the ways that matter. I walked up the hill until I could see the slope where the creek ran. The bridge that had learned about boys crouching under it. The place on the embankment where the night had once decided to show me its eyes. I said nothing. I didn't think a prayer would be heard any better if it wore a coat of words. A breeze moved the grass the way sleep moves the face of a child. A crow shouted the only thing it knows how to say. I stood there until my legs reminded me I owed them a chair, and then I went to the mausoleum and traced the seam of the door with a finger like a man pretending to read. You want me to say I walked back to the car and saw her one last time? You want me to say she stood at the top of the hill with the hood pulled low and the eyes like coals, and the kind of smile you can't prove is there until you taste it? I won't give you that. Not because it isn't what happened. Because stories earn what they ask from you by leaving a little room for the life you bring to them. This much is true. I walked back to the angel and put my hand on the cold book. And in the cold, I felt a warmth that wasn't temperature. I remembered the way my mother laughed. My father's quiet. My brother calling my name that night with the tone of a boy discovering what the word brother costs. I remembered the red under the hood and the way shame can be something other than punishment. I remembered a creek naming my socks and a spider waiting to see if we were related. I'm not afraid, I said out loud, and was surprised to hear it true. Not because nothing can hurt you. Not because death is a hallway with a light on at the far end. Because fear left alone too long grows teeth. And I had spent a life teaching mine to purr. I went home. The world went on being itself. Winter clenched and then softened. I woke, worked, ate the things a person eats when he believes he is the kind of person who still deserves to eat. I slept. Not always well. Often well enough. Do I believe in Black Aggie? I believe in a woman who came when I needed a witness. I believe in a hood and a glen and eyes that were a language, not a weapon. I believe in statues and the way we give them work to do so that our hearts don't have to do it alone. I believe in the harm a laugh can do and in the way an apology spoken to a foot of stone can unclench a fist you thought was your own. You want me to tell you what happens when I die? I will tell you what I know. The sidewalk will be the sidewalk. The window will be the window. The coffee will be the coffee for someone else. And somewhere the grass will move like sleep in the face of a child. I think she'll be there. I think I will look up whether from a bed or a floor or the driver's seat of a car that forgot its job and see the shape of a woman I have known longer than I've known what to call love. And I will say, all right. And she will say nothing. Because everything said to me by her has always been understood. Until then, there is this. A boy who learned how to stand with wet socks and eyes that did not glow but remembered how to be red. And there is this, a question for you. Do you think the violence we endure and the injustices we normalize as children become the monsters whose hands we hold as adults? Do you think legends like hers are born from hauntings? Or from the ways we fail each other and want to call that failure a ghost so we don't have to forgive anyone? Tell me what you believe. Take a side. Tell it plain. Put it in the place where the living go to be counted. I'll be listening.